Do not trust the loudest voice in the room, Evelyn whispered as the iron chains tightened around her wrists, because truth has never needed to shout. The words were so soft that only the Alpha King heard them, and somehow they echoed louder than the command he was about to give. Dawn spilled through the towering stained-glass windows of Blackridge Castle, painting the marble floor with ribbons of crimson and gold. Hundreds of wolves filled the royal hall, their polished armor gleaming beneath rows of flickering chandeliers. Yet an uneasy stillness hung over the gathering like the silence before a storm. At the center of the chamber stood Evelyn Carter, her white skin pale against the simple gray dress she had worn since the day she first entered the palace as an orphaned Omega with nothing except quiet courage and unwavering kindness. Cold iron circled her wrists, but her posture remained graceful, her shoulders straight, her blue eyes calm despite every whisper surrounding her. Noble families watched from carved balconies, their conversations reduced to cautious murmurs. Some looked at her with disappointment, others with satisfaction. They had spent weeks repeating the same rumor until it sounded like fact. The king's Omega had betrayed the crown. She had passed royal secrets beyond the borders of Blackridge. She had earned the punishment now waiting for her. Kieran Blackwood sat upon the ancient throne carved from black stone, the silver wolf crest rising high behind him. He had faced invading armies without hesitation. He had settled blood feuds that lasted generations. He had carried the weight of an entire kingdom without allowing doubt to reach his expression. Yet this morning, for the first time in years, certainty felt strangely unfamiliar. 3 sleepless nights had been consumed by reports, sworn testimony, official seals, and trusted advisors insisting every piece of evidence pointed toward one unbearable conclusion. Logic demanded judgment. Duty demanded sacrifice. But the quiet instinct that had protected him throughout his reign refused to fall silent. It lingered deep inside him, whispering that something invisible remained hidden beneath. The carefully arranged truth placed before his throne. Lord Victor Ashcombe stepped forward from the council, his measured voice filling the chamber. "Your Majesty, the court awaits your decision." Beside him, Lady Celeste Harrington lowered her eyes with rehearsed sympathy, while rows of nobles leaned forward, eager to witness the final judgment. Kieran slowly rose from the throne. The movement alone silenced every remaining whisper. His blue eyes drifted toward Evelyn, who finally lifted her gaze to meet his. She did not plead for mercy. She did not deny the accusations. She simply looked at him with the same quiet faith she had carried since the day she first walked beside him through these halls. That unwavering trust unsettled him more than any desperate defense ever could. For one impossible heartbeat, he almost asked everyone to leave, almost ordered the investigation to begin again, almost listened to the voice inside him instead of the voices surrounding him. Then duty won the battle his heart could not. "Take her away," he said. The words left his mouth with steady authority, but something inside him fractured the instant they echoed through the hall. 2 royal guards stepped forward, carefully guiding Evelyn toward the towering oak doors. The chains brushed softly against the polished stone floor with each measured step. Halfway across the chamber, she paused only long enough to glance toward the window overlooking the eastern mountains where a lone white hawk circled beneath the morning sky. A faint smile crossed her face, so brief that no one else seemed to notice it. Then she looked back at Kieran one final time. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. The heavy doors closed behind her with a deep thunderous sound that rolled across the chamber until even the proudest nobles lowered their eyes. Moments later, applause slowly began among members of the court, praising the king's strength and unwavering devotion to justice. Kieran heard none of it. His attention had settled on something small resting beside the throne where Evelyn always stood during royal assemblies. A bundle of dried lavender tied carefully with faded blue ribbon remained exactly where she had left it the evening before. Its gentle fragrance still lingered in the air, but for reasons he could not explain, the scent no longer brought comfort. Instead, it carried the quiet feeling that the greatest mistake of his life had just walked beyond the palace gates. The celebration began before the palace bells finished ringing, as though the kingdom had been waiting for permission to believe the nightmare was finally over. Musicians filled the marble corridors with triumphant melodies while servants hurried between endless banquet tables carrying roasted turkey, fresh bread, honey-glazed apples, and sparkling cider. Crystal glasses rose into the air as noble families praised the Alpha King's unwavering devotion to justice. Lord Victor Ashcombe accepted every compliment with practiced humility, reminding anyone who would listen that difficult choices defined great rulers. Lady Celeste Harrington moved gracefully from table to table, her voice warm with carefully measured sympathy. "It is heartbreaking," she sighed, "but the crown must always come before personal affection." The words spread through the hall like gentle rain, soothing every lingering doubt before it had the chance to grow. Yet not everyone celebrated. Near one of the towering pillars, Elder Thomas Whitmore remained standing with an untouched cup resting quietly in his hands. At nearly 80 years old, he had served 3 Alpha Kings and learned long ago that truth rarely arrived wearing polished armor. His tired eyes drifted toward the empty place beside the throne where Evelyn always stood during royal assemblies. The space felt strangely larger than it should have, as though the room itself recognized someone important was missing. He remembered the frightened young Omega who had entered Blackridge Castle years earlier, carrying nothing except a worn leather bag and quiet determination. He remembered the brutal winter when sickness spread through nearby villages, and Evelyn spent countless nights comforting frightened children and exhausted healers without asking for recognition. He remembered stable workers smiling whenever she visited because she always knew their names. He remembered guards standing a little straighter after speaking with her because somehow she made everyone feel seen. None of those memories resembled the traitor now described throughout the palace. Far beyond the castle walls, a wooden prison wagon rolled steadily along the eastern road beneath towering pine trees. The iron restraints around Evelyn's wrists remained secure, but her expression held neither fear nor resentment. She simply watched sunlight filter through the forest canopy as though committing every familiar landscape to memory. Across from her sat a young royal guard named Owen Parker, barely 20 years old, chosen only days earlier for his first assignment outside the capital. He had expected tears, pleading, perhaps anger directed toward the kingdom that had condemned her. Instead, Evelyn noticed him quietly rubbing his shoulder against the rough leather strap of his armor. "You injured it during training," she said gently. Owen looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" A faint smile crossed her face. "You keep shifting your weight every few minutes because it still hurts." Embarrassed, Owen nodded. "It will heal." Evelyn glanced toward the passing trees before speaking again. "Only if you allow yourself time to recover." The young guard could not understand how someone accused of betraying an entire kingdom still found kindness for a stranger escorting her away in chains. His questions remained trapped behind respectful silence. Back inside Blackridge Castle, Kieran sat alone after the banquet guests drifted into smaller conversations throughout the palace. Advisors continued placing reports before him, requesting signatures, discussing trade agreements, and congratulating him for restoring confidence across the realm. He signed each document almost automatically, but his attention never truly left the empty space beside the throne. The hall felt colder than usual. Even the applause lingering in distant corridors sounded strangely hollow. As he reached for another report, something caught his eye beside the carved armrest. The small bundle of dried lavender Evelyn replaced every month still rested exactly where she had left it. Its familiar fragrance had eased his headaches after countless exhausting council meetings. Today it carried only quiet unease. Almost without thinking, Kieran picked it up. The faded blue ribbon felt slightly thicker than he remembered. Curious, he gently loosened the knot. Folded carefully beneath the stems rested a tiny piece of parchment hidden so skillfully that no one else would have thought to search for it. His heartbeat slowed as he unfolded the familiar paper. Written in Evelyn's unmistakable hand were only 9 words. "Trust your own eyes when every voice tells you otherwise." For the first time since the palace doors had closed behind her, the celebration surrounding the Alpha King no longer sounded like victory. It sounded like noise. The 9 words refused to leave Kieran's mind. "Trust your own eyes when every voice tells you otherwise." He read them once, then again, tracing the familiar handwriting with his thumb until the ink itself seemed to carry Evelyn's quiet confidence. It was not the message of someone begging for mercy. It was the message of someone certain the truth had been buried beneath carefully arranged lies. Without another word, Kieran folded the parchment and slipped it inside his coat before leaving the banquet hall. The laughter faded behind him as he crossed the silent corridors of Blackridge Castle, his footsteps carrying him toward the royal archives hidden beneath the eastern tower. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight stretching across endless shelves filled with decades of royal records. Margaret Ellis, the elderly archivist who had faithfully guarded the kingdom's documents for more than 40 years, looked up in surprise as the Alpha King entered alone. "Your Majesty," she said with a respectful bow. "How may I serve you?" Kieran placed the investigation file concerning Evelyn upon the broad oak table. "Bring me every original record used during her hearing. Nothing copied. Nothing summarized. I want the first documents exactly as they arrived." Margaret hesitated only long enough to recognize the seriousness in his voice before disappearing into the towering shelves. Minutes later she returned carrying sealed ledgers, messenger logs, military reports, witness statements, and correspondence from every department involved in the investigation. Kieran opened the first folder in silence. At first glance, everything appeared exactly as he remembered from the council hearing. Witnesses placed Evelyn near confidential meetings. Official reports claimed she had secretly left the palace after midnight. Royal seals authenticated every page. It was the same mountain of evidence that had convinced him only hours earlier. Then his eyes stopped on a single handwritten letter. The words themselves appeared ordinary, but something about the handwriting felt strangely unfamiliar. He leaned closer. Every letter slanted sharply to the left. Kieran remained motionless for several seconds before quietly reaching into his coat. From another pocket, he removed a birthday card Evelyn had written for him 2 years earlier after insisting that handwritten wishes always mattered more than expensive gifts. He laid both pages side by side. The difference was unmistakable. Evelyn had always written with a gentle rightward slant, every sentence flowing smoothly across the page like a quiet stream. The document accusing her leaned the opposite direction entirely. He did not need an expert to tell him they were written by different hands. His heartbeat slowed into the calm that always arrived before difficult decisions. He opened the next report. According to its timestamp, Evelyn had secretly crossed the eastern gate shortly after 10 o'clock on the same evening. Another official registry recorded her serving beside Queen Eleanor during the annual harvest blessing attended by nearly 100 guests. Both records carried authentic royal seals. Both could not possibly be true. Margaret adjusted her spectacles as she noticed Kieran comparing the documents. "That should not happen," she murmured. Kieran continued reading without answering. A third report claimed 2 palace guards had witnessed Evelyn meeting an unknown messenger outside the southern courtyard. He immediately reached for the military duty roster. Those same guards had been assigned to overnight watch atop North Watchtower, nearly 3 miles away. They could not have witnessed anything in the southern courtyard because they had never been there. One inconsistency might have been a mistake. 2 might have been carelessness. But 3 impossible records pointing in exactly the same direction were no coincidence. Someone had not merely fabricated evidence. Someone had carefully constructed an entire version of reality. Kieran slowly closed the final folder and stared through the tall archive window where dark clouds gathered above Blackridge Castle once again. He finally understood what Evelyn had tried to tell him. The loudest voices had never wanted him to examine the evidence. They only wanted him to accept it before he looked closely enough to see what his own eyes would never have allowed him to ignore. The first roll of thunder echoed across Blackridge Castle as Kieran remained standing beside the archive table, every forged document spread before him like pieces of a carefully crafted illusion. He no longer needed someone to tell him that Evelyn had been framed. The evidence was revealing its own story, one contradiction at a time. Before he could organize another report, a cautious knock interrupted the silence. Margaret Ellis opened the heavy archive door just enough to peer inside. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "there is someone outside insisting he must see you immediately. He says Lady Evelyn trusted only you to receive what he carries." Kieran answered without hesitation. "Send him in." A weathered old man stepped carefully into the room, removing his rain-soaked cap as droplets fell onto the stone floor. Samuel Brooks, the royal stable master, looked far older than he had only a week before. Deep exhaustion rested beneath his eyes. He held a small leather pouch tightly against his chest, as though he had guarded it for days without sleeping. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Samuel said, struggling to steady his voice. "I should have come sooner." Kieran watched him carefully. "Why did you not?" Samuel lowered his eyes. "Because they searched my home twice. They questioned every stable hand. One groom disappeared after asking too many questions. Lady, Evelyn told me that if anyone discovered what she left behind, neither of us would live long enough to place it in your hands. I buried it beneath the stable floor until I knew their eyes had turned elsewhere." Slowly, Samuel placed the worn leather pouch onto the table. Kieran untied the cord himself. Inside rested a silver signet ring engraved with the crest of the Eastern Border Alliance. Beneath it lay a sealed letter bearing the personal mark of General Nathan Hale, commander of the Eastern Frontier. Kieran immediately recognized the seal. He broke it open. The letter had been written nearly 3 weeks earlier. General Hale warned that unknown agents had been bribing officials inside Blackridge in preparation for the upcoming Alliance Summit. More troubling still, several intercepted messages suggested the conspiracy had reached members of the Royal Council itself. The general urged absolute secrecy, fearing that ordinary messengers could no longer be trusted. Folded inside the same letter rested a second sheet written in Evelyn's familiar hand. "Every messenger I sent has disappeared. 2 letters never reached your desk. One maid who agreed to help me resigned without explanation the next morning. Someone inside the palace knows every move I make. Until I discover who still serves the crown honestly, I cannot speak openly. If I accuse the wrong person too soon, the truth will vanish before it reaches you." Kieran closed his eyes for a brief moment as every unanswered question suddenly aligned. Evelyn had never remained silent because she feared punishment. She had remained silent because every attempt to warn him had been intercepted before it could reach him. Samuel pointed toward the letter with trembling fingers. She believed they wanted her to panic. She said that if she defended herself too early, the real traitors would simply disappear and begin again somewhere else. She chose to let them believe they had won. Kieran slowly looked up. She trusted that I would eventually uncover the truth. Samuel nodded. "Those were her exact words, Your Majesty," she said. "The Alpha King has always trusted his own eyes. I only pray he remembers before it is too late." The room fell silent once more. Outside, rain swept across the castle roofs while distant thunder rolled through the valley. Kieran folded Evelyn's letter with extraordinary care before placing it beside the small piece of lavender ribbon still resting in his pocket. Every clue she had left behind had been carefully planned. Every risk she accepted had been taken to protect both her king and the kingdom he loved. And for the first time since she had been led away from the palace, Kieran understood that the greatest sacrifice Evelyn had made was not her freedom. It was placing her faith in him after every reason to believe he would fail her. Kieran left the archives without another word, Evelyn's letter resting safely inside his coat beside the small bundle of lavender. The weight of both felt heavier than the royal sword hanging at his side. Every step through the palace echoed with a single realization. She had not asked him to save her. She had only asked him to see the truth for himself. By the time he reached the grand staircase, the rain had intensified, beating against the stained glass windows until the colorful reflections across the marble floor disappeared beneath gray shadows. Servants quietly stepped aside as the Alpha King crossed the entrance hall with a determination none of them had witnessed in years. Captain Daniel Mercer hurried toward him, sensing immediately that something had changed. "Your Majesty?" Kieran did not slow his pace. "Take me to the royal holding cells." Daniel hesitated only long enough to signal 2 guards before following. They descended through narrow stone passages beneath the castle where the air grew colder with every level. Water dripped slowly from the ancient ceiling, and the sound of distant thunder seemed to follow them underground. Reaching the final corridor, Daniel removed a heavy bronze key from his belt and unlocked the last iron gate. "She was kept here," he said quietly. Kieran stepped inside. The small chamber stood perfectly still. A wooden bed remained untouched against the wall. A clay cup rested beside a narrow window where faint daylight filtered through iron bars. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken chains scattered across the floor. Instead, lying neatly in the center of the room rested a pair of opened restraints placed carefully side by side, almost as though someone had removed them with respect rather than haste. Kieran slowly knelt and lifted one of the iron cuffs into his hands. The metal still carried a trace of warmth from the afternoon sun that had reached through the tiny window only hours before. She had been here. She had waited here. And she had left believing he had chosen not to believe her. "Where is she?" Kieran asked without looking up. Daniel swallowed hard before answering. "She was transferred, Your Majesty." Kieran's eyes narrowed. Transferred. An emergency order arrived less than an hour after the hearing. Daniel immediately handed him a folded document sealed with the Royal Emergency crest, a symbol reserved for situations requiring immediate action without delay. The order stated that Lady Evelyn was to be moved to Grey Hollow Fortress under direct authority from the Crown because of newly discovered security concerns. Kieran unfolded the document. At first glance, everything appeared authentic. The emergency seal was genuine. The parchment came from the royal office. But when his eyes reached the signature, the same cold certainty settled over him that he had felt inside the archives. The signature was not his. Someone had copied it with remarkable skill, but not perfectly. The final stroke beneath his family name curved upward instead of ending with the sharp downward line he had written since inheriting the throne. It was convincing enough to fool any officer following protocol, but not convincing enough to deceive the man who had written that signature thousands of times. "Who delivered this?" Kieran asked. Daniel consulted the duty ledger. "Commander Richard Holloway's escort, according to the transfer papers." Kieran looked up immediately. Richard Holloway had requested official leave 3 days earlier to care for his seriously ill father nearly 200 miles south of Blackridge. Kieran had personally approved the request. Richard could not have delivered the order, because he was never here. A long silence settled over the chamber as every piece finally connected. The forged reports, the intercepted letters, the false witnesses, the counterfeit signature. They had never intended to imprison Evelyn inside Blackridge Castle. They had only needed enough time to move her beyond the king's reach before he discovered the deception. Kieran slowly closed the forged order and looked once more at the empty cell. Every moment he remained inside these walls carried Evelyn farther away, and somewhere beyond the eastern mountains, the people truly responsible were counting on him realizing the truth just a little too late. Before the forged transfer order had fully left his hands, Kieran was already climbing the stone staircase 2 steps at a time. By the moment he emerged into the main courtyard, the steady rain had become a cold downpour, drumming against castle walls and washing away every trace of the celebration that had filled Blackridge only hours earlier. Soldiers stopped whatever they were doing as the Alpha King crossed the courtyard with unmistakable purpose. They had seen him determined before. They had seen him fearless. They had never seen him like this. "Captain Mercer," Kieran called without slowing. "Sound the royal horns." Daniel looked up immediately. "Your Majesty?" "Seal every gate leading in and out of Blackridge. No rider leaves without my written command. Dispatch the 1st, 3rd, and 7th Ranger companies. Search every eastern road, every river crossing, every mountain trail, every abandoned outpost within 100 miles. I want reports every 30 minutes. Daniel placed a fist over his heart. "Immediately, Your Majesty." Seconds later, the deep voice of the royal bronze horns rolled across the kingdom. One blast, then another, then a third. The sound echoed from tower to tower until every guard understood this was no ordinary alarm. Stable doors flew open. Messengers mounted fresh horses. Ranger patrols disappeared into the rain in every direction while servants hurried frightened guests inside the palace. The joyful music that had filled the banquet hall only an hour earlier vanished completely, replaced by disciplined urgency. Inside the royal council chamber, Lord Victor Ashcombe slowly lowered the crystal glass he had been holding as the horns continued sounding beyond the tall windows. Around the long oak table, noble families exchanged uneasy glances. No emergency had been declared in Blackridge for nearly a decade. Before anyone could speculate further, the massive doors opened. Kieran entered alone. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his dark cloak, but his steady blue eyes revealed something far colder than anger. They revealed certainty. Without speaking, he walked to the center of the chamber and placed the forged transfer order, Evelyn's hidden letter, and 3 contradictory investigation reports onto the polished table. Every council member instinctively leaned forward. Someone inside this room, Kieran said quietly, has betrayed the crown. Silence swallowed the chamber. Lady Celeste Harrington forced a look of confusion. Your Majesty, surely there has been some misunderstanding. Kieran looked at her only briefly before turning toward the assembled council. The misunderstanding ended the moment I examined the original records instead of the summaries placed before me. Lord Victor folded his hands calmly. If emotions are influencing today's decisions, perhaps we should allow time before making accusations. Kieran slid the forged document across the table until it stopped directly in front of him. Then explain why this emergency transfer carries a signature that is not mine. No answer came. Kieran continued before anyone else could interrupt. Explain why 2 witnesses were officially stationed 3 miles away when they claimed to see Evelyn inside the southern courtyard. Explain why reports place her in 2 different locations during the same hour. Explain why every warning sent from the eastern frontier disappeared before reaching my desk. One by one, confident expressions faded throughout the chamber. Some nobles stared down at the evidence in disbelief. Others slowly realized the investigation had been manipulated from the very beginning. Only Lord Victor remained unusually composed, though the color had quietly drained from his face. At that exact moment, the council doors burst open once again. A rain-soaked royal ranger hurried inside, breathing hard after what had clearly been a relentless ride through the storm. He dropped to one knee and held out a sealed dispatch. Urgent message from Eastwatch Crossing, Your Majesty. Kieran broke the seal immediately. His eyes moved rapidly across the report before stopping on its final sentence. The escort assigned to transport Evelyn had never reached the first official checkpoint. None of the men identified on the forged order had reported their arrival. They had abandoned the scheduled route less than 20 miles from Blackridge, disappearing onto an unmarked mountain trail before any royal patrol could intercept them. Kieran slowly folded the dispatch. The deception was no longer hidden inside palace walls. It was moving farther away with every passing minute, and somewhere beyond the eastern mountains, Evelyn was still trusting that he would find the truth before those responsible erased every remaining trace of it. The storm finally drifted east before sunrise, leaving the forests wrapped in a pale blanket of mist that softened every ridge and valley surrounding Blackridge. Kieran rode at the front of the search party, his powerful white wolf moving silently over rain-soaked earth, while Captain Daniel Mercer and a dozen royal rangers followed close behind. The silver compass rested inside the Alpha King's coat beside Evelyn's letters, and for the first time since she had been taken away, every clue she left behind no longer felt random. She had been guiding him, not toward herself alone, but toward the truth. Nearly 3 hours into the search, one of the rangers suddenly raised his hand. Tracks, he whispered. Fresh wagon marks cut away from the official road and disappeared into a narrow mountain path almost hidden beneath fallen branches. Kieran dismounted immediately. The tracks were deliberate. Someone had carefully brushed away obvious signs before continuing deeper into the forest. They followed the trail until it opened into a small clearing where the remains of an abandoned campsite sat beneath towering pine trees. A cold fire pit rested in the center. Several travel packs had been discarded beside a broken wagon wheel. Nothing looked rushed. It looked planned. Captain Mercer slowly knelt beside the fire, studying the damp ground before reaching beneath a loose stone. Your Majesty. He lifted a small leather journal wrapped inside waxed cloth to protect it from the rain. The cover carried a familiar name burned into the leather. Owen Parker. Kieran immediately recognized the young guard who had been assigned to escort Evelyn from the castle. He carefully opened the journal. Most pages contained routine travel notes, inventory counts, and weather observations. Then he reached the final entry. The handwriting grew hurried, as though every second had mattered. Lady Evelyn was right. The men leading this escort are not the guards listed on the transfer order. They wear our uniforms, but they do not know our signals. Commander Holloway never arrived. Lady Evelyn realized the deception before we reached Eastwatch Crossing. She told me not to resist because innocent men would lose their lives before the real traitors revealed themselves. She believes the Alpha King will uncover the truth if enough evidence survives. If anyone finds this journal, tell His Majesty she never betrayed him. She was protecting him from the beginning. Kieran closed the journal slowly. Around him, no one spoke. Even the forest seemed unnaturally still. Captain Mercer looked toward the abandoned campsite. She knew they were imposters. She knew before anyone else, Kieran answered quietly. And she still chose to leave us a trail instead of placing soldiers in danger. One of the rangers called from the edge of the clearing. There is something here. Hidden beneath a fallen cedar branch lay a small silver compass. Its glass face was cracked, but the needle still pointed steadily north. Kieran bent down and lifted it with extraordinary care. Years earlier, before Evelyn traveled to negotiate peace with a neighboring pack, he had given her that compass, joking that even if she became hopelessly lost, it would always bring her home. She had laughed and answered, "People need something stronger than a compass. They need someone worth finding their way back to." He had almost forgotten those words. Now they returned with painful clarity. This was no accident. She had left the compass exactly where he would find it, because she knew he would remember. Captain Mercer studied the mountains rising beyond the clearing. The wagon stopped here, but only one set of tracks continues east. Whoever brought Lady Evelyn abandoned the disguise and continued on foot. Kieran slipped the compass into his coat beside the lavender ribbon and Owen's journal. Every clue pointed in the same direction. Every piece fit together with careful intention. Evelyn had trusted his instincts even after he failed to trust hers. Looking toward the narrow mountain pass disappearing into the morning mist, Kieran drew one slow breath before speaking the words that sent every ranger forward. She is no longer leaving us clues because she doubts we can find her. She is leaving them because she believes we will. We are closer than they think. Move. The mountain trail narrowed until it disappeared beneath towering evergreens, where morning sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. Every step forward carried a silence so complete that even the birds seemed unwilling to disturb it. Kieran slowed his wolf as the broken remains of an old ranger cabin appeared between weathered pines, hidden so carefully among moss-covered boulders that it could easily have been overlooked by anyone who was not searching for it. Thin wisps of smoke no longer rose from the stone chimney. The place had been occupied recently, but whoever had stayed there had left in a hurry. Captain Daniel Mercer raised his hand, signaling the rangers to spread out quietly around the clearing. They searched the perimeter without finding a single guard. No sentries, no patrols, no wagon, only fresh footprints leading away from the cabin toward the eastern ridge. Daniel frowned. It looks like they abandoned the place. Kieran's eyes moved across the clearing until they settled on something hanging from the cabin's wooden door. A single sprig of dried lavender swayed gently in the breeze. His heart tightened. Evelyn had left. Another sign. She wanted him to know he had reached the right place. He slowly pushed the weathered door open. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating a modest room with a rough wooden table, an empty fireplace, and a narrow bed neatly covered by a folded blanket. Sitting quietly beside the window was Evelyn Carter. Her restraints were gone. She looked toward the mountains beyond the glass as though she had been watching the road for hours, waiting not for rescue, but for certainty. She turned her head only after hearing the familiar rhythm of Kieran's footsteps crossing the wooden floor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Every apology Kieran had repeated in his mind during the endless ride through the mountains suddenly vanished. The silence between them carried more honesty than words ever could. Evelyn offered a faint smile that never quite reached her tired eyes. "You followed the compass," she said softly. Kieran nodded. "And the lavender, and every path you left behind." She lowered her gaze for a brief moment before answering. "I was never trying to escape. I was trying to make sure only you could find the truth." Kieran took one careful step closer. "Where are they?" Evelyn looked toward the open doorway. "They left before sunrise. A rider reached the cabin during the night. Someone told them the royal horns had sounded across Blackridge and every road was being searched. They panicked. They argued among themselves, gathered what they could carry, and disappeared into the eastern mountains before dawn." Daniel quietly entered the cabin after confirming the clearing was secure. "Did they harm you?" Evelyn slowly shook her head. "They needed me alive. As long as everyone believed I was guilty, I remained more valuable as a prisoner than as a witness." Daniel respectfully stepped back outside, leaving the two of them alone once more. Kieran finally closed the remaining distance between them, stopping only an arm's length away. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why did you still believe I would come?" Evelyn looked at him with quiet sadness rather than disappointment. Because the man I chose to stand beside has always questioned what everyone else accepted without thinking. For one day, you forgot that part of yourself. I never did. Kieran lowered his head, drawing one slow breath before speaking again. I believed documents instead of the woman who had spent years proving her loyalty without asking for recognition. I cannot undo that. Another long silence settled between them. Evelyn looked out through the window where the same white hawk circled high above the valley before slowly turning back toward him. "No," she said gently. "You cannot undo it." The words lingered in the quiet room, and for a brief moment Kieran felt the full weight of his failure. Then Evelyn reached into the pocket of her simple gray dress and carefully unfolded the small piece of parchment he had found hidden beneath the lavender. She placed it back into his hand. "But you listened before it was too late to choose who you become next." 3 days later, the great hall of Blackridge Castle filled once again, but this time no music echoed beneath its towering stone arches. The celebration had been replaced by reflection. Every noble, military commander, village elder, and palace servant had been summoned to witness what the Alpha King himself called the most important judgment of his reign. Morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, bathing the ancient wolf crest in warm shades of gold instead of the cold crimson light that had filled the chamber only days before. Kieran Blackwood did not sit upon the throne waiting for the assembly to begin. Instead, he stood on the marble floor before it, dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in the same dark cloak he had worn throughout the search for Evelyn. Beside him stood Evelyn Carter, wearing a simple pale blue dress with no jewels, no royal ornaments, and no symbols of status. She had asked for none of them. The quiet strength that had carried her through every trial needed no decoration. Along the council table, several seats remained empty. Lord Victor Ashcombe and the officials who had helped manipulate the investigation had already been removed from office after a lawful inquiry uncovered forged documents, intercepted correspondence, and the conspiracy to fracture Blackridge before the Eastern Alliance summit. Their influence had ended not through revenge, but through justice carried out under the kingdom's own laws. Kieran stepped forward until he stood in the very place where he had once pronounced judgment against the woman now standing beside him. The entire hall fell silent. Slowly, he reached into a wooden chest resting near the throne and removed the pair of iron restraints that had been recovered from Evelyn's empty holding cell. Every eye followed the quiet movement. Kieran looked at the cold metal for a long moment before placing it gently at the foot of the ancient throne where every future ruler of Blackridge would see it. "Let these remain here," he said, his steady voice carrying through the silent hall. "Not as a reminder of her disgrace, but as a reminder of mine. May every Alpha King who sits upon this throne remember that justice begins by listening before judging, and that the loudest voices are not always the truest ones." No one moved. No one spoke. Then, before the entire kingdom, Kieran turned toward Evelyn and slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A wave of astonished whispers swept across the hall before disappearing into complete silence once more. "I asked my people to trust my judgment," he said, looking directly into Evelyn's eyes. "But I failed to trust the person who had earned that trust more than anyone else. I cannot erase the pain my decision caused, but I can promise that my pride will never again stand above the truth. Before every witness gathered here today, I ask for your forgiveness." Evelyn looked down at him for several quiet moments. Tears did not fill her eyes. Anger did not harden her expression. Instead, she offered the same calm smile that had remained unbroken even on the day she walked out of this castle in chains. She extended her hand toward him. "Forgiveness is not forgetting," she said gently. "It is choosing not to let yesterday decide who we become tomorrow." Kieran accepted her hand and rose to his feet beside her. Turning toward the assembled court, he announced a series of reforms that would forever change Blackridge. Every future accusation against any citizen would require independent review. No investigation would rely upon a single chain of authority. Anonymous testimony would never again outweigh verified evidence. Every member of the royal council, including the Alpha King himself, would be subject to the same standards of accountability under the law. The elders placed their hands over their hearts in solemn agreement, and one by one the people throughout the hall followed. Later that afternoon, after the assembly had ended, Kieran and Evelyn walked quietly through the palace gardens where fresh lavender had already been planted beneath the eastern windows. The familiar fragrance drifted gently across the warm breeze. Above them, a lone white hawk circled once before disappearing beyond the distant mountains. Just as it had on the morning everything fell apart. Kieran reached for Evelyn's hand, and this time he held it without hesitation, not because he feared losing her again, but because he finally understood what she had known all along. A kingdom is not measured by the strength of its throne. It is measured by the courage of its people to seek the truth, the humility of its leaders to admit when they are wrong, and the quiet faith of those who choose to keep believing even when belief is the hardest path of all. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.